He was the biggest star in the world, but nobody at the tiny church recognized him when he walked through the door. James Brown sat in the back pew where he used to sit as a hungry kid and started singing. What happened next reminded everyone in that room why true greatness has nothing to do with fame. It was a Sunday morning in October 1972. James Brown had just finished a grueling 6-week tour that had taken him across America and Europe. He'd performed for presidents, sold out Madison Square Garden twice in 1 week, and had 3 songs in the top 10. He was exhausted, wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined as a child, and famous in a way that made it impossible to go anywhere without being recognized. But on this particular Sunday morning, James wasn't heading to his mansion in Queens or his estate in Georgia. He was driving through Augusta, Georgia, in a rental car, not his Rolls-Royce, not his Cadillac, just a plain sedan, heading toward a neighborhood he hadn't visited in over 20 years. The neighborhood looked smaller than he remembered. The houses were still poor, still run down, still struggling. Nothing had changed except him. He'd left this place with nothing and become somebody. But as he drove through those familiar streets, all the fame and money felt like a costume he was wearing over the kid he used to be. He pulled up to Mount Zion Baptist Church, a small white wooden building that needed a fresh coat of paint. The sign out front was weathered but readable. Service started at 11. It was 10:55. James sat in the car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, wondering what he was doing here. His manager didn't know where he was. His band thought he was resting at a hotel, but something had pulled him here. Some need he couldn't explain. He was wearing a simple dark suit, expensive but not flashy. No sequins, no cape, no processed hair. Just James. He walked up the 3 wooden steps to the door, the same steps he used to sweep as a boy in exchange for Sunday breakfast. Inside, the church was exactly as he remembered. 20 rows of wooden pews, windows on both sides letting in morning light, a small altar at the front with a simple wooden cross. Maybe 40 people scattered throughout the pews, elderly folks, a few families with children, some teenagers in their Sunday best. Nobody turned to look at him. Nobody gasped or pointed. To them, he was just another visitor, another face. In this church, James Brown the superstar didn't exist. Only James the man. He slipped into a back pew, the same pew where he used to sit as a child when his aunt would bring him. The same pew where he'd prayed as a hungry 10-year-old, asking God why his mother had left, why his stomach hurt from not eating, why nobody wanted him. The congregation was singing when he sat down. The piano was slightly out of tune, just like it had always been. The voices were simple, earnest, not polished or professional. Just people singing to God because they needed to. James sat there, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something break open inside him. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was being back in this place. Maybe it was remembering who he used to be. Maybe it was realizing how far he'd come and wondering if he'd lost something essential along the way. The pastor was Reverend Thomas, the same Reverend Thomas who'd been here when James was a child, just older now, grayer, moving a little slower. He was giving the sermon, talking about remembering where you came from, about staying humble no matter how high you climb, about the difference between worldly success and spiritual wealth. James wondered if God had a sense of humor, bringing him here on the exact Sunday when this particular sermon was being preached. After the sermon, Reverend Thomas asked if there were any visitors who'd like to introduce themselves. James felt his heart start pounding. He could stay quiet, slip out after service, and nobody would ever know the Godfather of Soul had been here. But then he thought about all the times he performed for thousands, for presidents, for royalty. And here he was, afraid to stand up in a church with 40 people. James stood up. Every eye in the church turned to him. Reverend Thomas squinted, trying to place the face. "Yes, brother? Would you like to introduce yourself?" James cleared his throat. His voice, which could command arenas, came out quiet. "My name is James Brown. I used to come to this church when I was a boy." "Reverend Thomas, you probably don't remember me, but you used to give me breakfast after service when I was hungry." The church went completely silent. Then someone gasped. Then someone else said, "That's James Brown, the singer. That's really him." Reverend Thomas walked down from the altar, staring at James like he was seeing a ghost. "Little James? Little James Brown who used to sleep in the back pew sometimes?" "Yes, sir." The elderly Reverend's eyes filled with tears. My Lord, look at you. Look what God has done." He walked to James and embraced him. James, who was 6 feet tall and hadn't been little in decades, felt like a child in the old man's arms. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" the Reverend asked. "I didn't know I was coming," James said honestly. "I just needed to be here." Reverend Thomas kept his hands on James's shoulders, looking at him with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you all right, son?" James opened his mouth to say yes, to give the answer everyone expected. But what came out was the truth. "I don't know. I have everything I ever dreamed of having, but I'm tired, Reverend. I'm so tired. And I can't remember the last time I felt like me." The congregation was completely silent, watching this famous man admit to struggling, admit to being lost. "Would you sing for us, James?" the Reverend asked. "Would you sing the way you used to when you were a boy?" James wiped his eyes. "I don't know if I remember how to sing like that anymore. Everything I sing now, it's a performance. It's for the crowd, for the show. I don't know if I remember how to just sing." "Then maybe it's time you remembered," the Reverend said gently. "Come up to the altar." James walked to the front of the church, past the pews where people were crying, past the elderly piano player who was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. He stood at the altar, in front of the simple wooden cross, and felt completely exposed. "What should I sing?" he asked. "What did you used to sing when you were a boy?" the Reverend asked. James thought back. Before the fame, before the records, before he became James Brown the entertainer. Back when he was just a scared, hungry kid who didn't know if he'd survive. What had he sung then? "There was a song," James said quietly. "One of the church ladies used to sing it. His eye is on the sparrow. She said it was for people who felt forgotten." "Sing it," the Reverend said. James closed his eyes, and then he started to sing. It wasn't like his performances. There were no splits, no spins, no screams. His voice was quiet, vulnerable, full of all the pain and longing and hope he'd felt as a child. He wasn't performing. He was praying. The congregation joined in softly, their voices wrapping around his. The elderly pianist played gently, following James's lead rather than driving the song. As James sang, something happened. The exhaustion he'd been carrying for months started to lift. The pressure to be perfect, to be James Brown the legend, began to ease. In this moment, in this tiny church where nobody expected anything from him except honesty, he could just be James. Tears were streaming down his face. His voice cracked on certain notes, but he didn't try to fix it or make it smooth. He let it be broken, let it be real. When the song ended, the church was silent, except for the sound of people crying. James opened his eyes and saw that almost everyone was in tears, not because he was famous, but because they'd witnessed something sacred. They'd seen a soul come home. Reverend Thomas stepped forward and put his hand on James's shoulder. "Thank you for that, son. Thank you for reminding us that no matter how far we go, no matter what we achieve, we all need to come back to the place where we learn to pray." An elderly woman in the front row, James recognized her now as Sister Margaret, who used to give him candy when he was a child, spoke up. "Mr. Brown, can I ask you something?" "Yes, ma'am." "With all you've accomplished, with all the places you've been, all the people you've met, what made you come back here today?" James thought about it. "Because I needed to remember who I was before I became who I am. I needed to remember that before I was James Brown the entertainer, I was just James, a scared kid who didn't have anything except hope and a voice. And I needed to remember where that hope came from." Another voice, a young man in his 20s. "Do you ever regret it? Becoming famous? Having to be James Brown all the time?" James shook his head. "I don't regret the success, but I do regret sometimes that I forgot there's a difference between being somebody and being somebody real. Fame can make you somebody in the world's eyes, but it can also make you nobody to yourself if you're not careful." He looked around the church. "In here, I'm not the godfather of soul. I'm not the hardest working man in show business. I'm just James Brown, the kid who used to sweep these floors. And you know what? That feels more real than anything I've felt in a long time." Reverend Thomas invited James to stay for the fellowship meal after service. James called his manager, told him he'd be back tomorrow, and ignored the protests. He spent the afternoon eating fried chicken and potato salad with people who'd known him when he was nothing, people who treated him like he was still just James from the neighborhood. Sister Margaret told him she'd prayed for him every Sunday for 20 years. An old man named Mr. Williams said he'd seen James on TV and always knew that hungry kid would amount to something. A young mother asked if he'd hold her baby, and James realized it was the first time in years someone had trusted him with something fragile without it being a publicity opportunity. As the afternoon wore on, James helped clean up, washing dishes, folding chairs, sweeping the floor, just like he used to. The other church members tried to stop him, saying, "Mr. Brown, you don't need to do that." But he insisted. It felt good. It felt grounding. Before he left, Reverend Thomas walked him to his car. "James, can I give you some advice?" "Yes, sir." "Don't wait another 20 years to come back. And I don't just mean this church. I mean this version of yourself. The James who can be vulnerable, who can admit he's tired, who can sing without performing. The world needs James Brown the entertainer. But you need James Brown the man." James nodded, unable to speak. "And one more thing," the Reverend said. "You asked God a lot of questions when you were a boy. Why your mother left, why you were poor, why nobody wanted you. I think today you got your answer. God was preparing you, not just to be famous, but to help people. Every kid who sees you and thinks, if James Brown can make it from nothing, maybe I can too, that's your purpose. But you can't help them if you forget where you came from." James drove back to his hotel that evening, feeling different, lighter, more himself. The next day he returned to touring, to being James Brown the superstar. But something had shifted. From that day forward, James made it a practice to find moments of anonymity. He'd slip into small churches when he was on tour, not to perform, but to remember, to pray, to reconnect with the part of himself that existed before the fame. He started a foundation to help kids from poor backgrounds get music education. He went back to Augusta regularly, not for publicity, but to actually be there, to visit Mount Zion Baptist Church and sit in that back pew and remember that being somebody in the world's eyes means nothing if you lose yourself in the process. Years later, in an interview, James was asked about the secret to his longevity, to staying grounded despite decades of fame. "I go back," he said. "I go back to the places that knew me when I was nobody. I go back to the people who remember James before he became James Brown. Because fame is temporary, success can disappear overnight, but who you are, the core of who you are, that's permanent. And if you lose that, you've lost everything that matters." The interviewer asked if he had a specific moment when he learned that lesson. James smiled. October 1972, a little church in Augusta, Georgia. "I walked in as the godfather of soul and walked out as just James. Best performance I ever gave was the day I stopped performing." The story of James Brown returning to Mount Zion Baptist Church became something of a legend in Augusta. People who were there that day never forgot it, not because a famous man came to their church, but because they witnessed something rare, a superstar becoming human again, a legend remembering how to be a person. The lesson isn't just for famous people. It's for anyone who's achieved something, climbed somewhere, become something different than who they started as. Success changes you. That's inevitable. But the question is whether you let it disconnect you from the person you were before the success came. James Brown conquered the world. He became the godfather of soul, revolutionized music, and created a legacy that will last forever. But his greatest achievement might have been that day in a small church, when he had the humility to remember he was once just a hungry kid praying for a miracle. True greatness isn't about how high you climb. It's about whether you remember the ground you came from. It's about whether you can still recognize yourself when you strip away all the things the world knows you for. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable in front of people who know the truth, that underneath all the fame and success, you're still just human, still searching, still needing grace. If this story of humility, returning home, and remembering who you were before you became who you are, moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that success means nothing if you lose yourself. Subscribe for more stories about legends who stayed human. And remember, you can conquer the world and still need to come home to the place where people knew you before you were anybody special. That's not weakness. That's wisdom.